Breaking right now. Trump says it's over. Iran says they won, but the explosions didn't stop. So, what actually just happened? At 6:07 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, April 7th, 2026, less than 2 hours before his own deadline for the destruction of every bridge and every power plant in Iran, the President of the United States posted on Truth Social. He called it a double-sided ceasefire. He said the United States had already met and exceeded all military objectives. He said the two countries were very far along with a definitive agreement concerning long-term peace with Iran and peace in the Middle East. He said he had received a 10-point proposal from Iran and believed it was a workable basis on which to negotiate. He said almost all of the various points of past contention had been agreed to between the United States and Iran. He called it a big day for world peace. He said Iran can start the reconstruction process. He said this could be the golden age of the Middle East. And he wrote in the informal celebratory tone that has become the signature of American wartime diplomacy in 2026 that the U.S. would be loading up with supplies of all kinds and just hanging around in order to make sure everything goes well. 20 minutes later, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed Thrawn's acceptance. He said Iran would cease its defensive operations if the United States halted its attacks. He said that for a period of 2 weeks, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. The phrase due consideration of technical limitations is not the complete, immediate, and safe opening that Trump had demanded. It is a managed reopening coordinated with Iranian military command on Iranian terms. Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued a statement. It said nearly all the objectives of the war have been achieved. It laid out the terms of Iran's 10-point proposal as the framework for what had just been agreed, including the lifting of all sanctions and UN resolutions against Iran, the release of Iranian assets held overseas, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from military bases across the region, compensation in the form of reparations, and Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. It warned that this does not signify the termination of the war, and that our hands remain upon the trigger, and should the slightest error be committed by the enemy, it shall be met with full force. Buying the ways YT. 2 countries, 2 announcements, 2 victories, 2 completely different descriptions of what had just been agreed. Welcome to the Islamabad Accord, the ceasefire that ended 40 days of war and that both sides are already reinterpreting before the ink is dry. To understand what actually happened and what it means, you need to go through the documented sequence of the last 48 hours. Because the gap between the morning of April 7th and the evening of April 7th contains the most dramatic single-day reversal of American wartime rhetoric since this conflict began on February 20th. And the details of that reversal explain why the ceasefire is simultaneously a genuine achievement and a fragile construction that could collapse before the Islamabad talks, scheduled for Friday, even begin. On the morning of Tuesday, April 7th, on August 7th, Trump wrote on Truth Social, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. A bike treat dash thou. too. He added, I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. I'd go to Napasers too. This was not ambiguous diplomatic language. This was the President of the United States predicting the civilizational destruction of a country of 90 million people before the end of the business day. U.S. and Israeli jets were striking tan as he wrote it. The South Pars petrochemical complex, the largest natural gas field in the world shared between Iran and Qatar, was struck by Israeli jets. The Mahashar petrochemical zone was hit again. Karg Island, through which 80% of Iran's oil exports had historically passed, was struck for the first time. Iranian state media reported casualties and fires. Oil was at 115 per barrel. The S&P 500 was down. Jet fuel was being rationed at Italian airports. Iran's deputy minister of youth was calling on young people to form human chains around power plants. The deadline was hours away. And then less than 2 hours before the deadline, with with Whitehoff in the room and Pakistan's army chief having spent 4 days on the phone without sleep, the ceasefire was announced. Oil fell 13% in the hour after the announcement. U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate dropped from above $105 to below $92 in 60 minutes, one of the largest single-hour oil price moves in market history. The S&P 500 futures rose more than 1% immediately. Markets in Asia opened higher. The global economy exhaled 40 days of tension in a single hour of trading. But the ceasefire that the market celebrated and the ceasefire that Israel's prime minister described are not the same document. This is the most important fact about the Islamabad Accord has not been adequately covered, and it is the fact that will determine whether the 2 weeks of negotiations in Islamabad produce a permanent agreement or a collapse into renewed conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office issued a statement saying Israel supports Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran for 2 weeks, subject to Iran immediately opening the strait and stopping all attacks on the U.S., Israel, and countries in the region. That statement then added 5 words that contradict Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's statement about the deal's scope. The 2-week ceasefire does not include Lebanon. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif had said in his announcement that the ceasefire will take effect immediately and includes Lebanon and elsewhere. Netanyahu said no. Sharif said yes. Trump did not clarify. Within hours of the ceasefire announcement, the Israeli Defense Forces issued evacuation warnings in Lebanon, including in the city of Tai and for all residents of Beirut's southern suburbs. Missile alerts sounded in Israel and the UAE after the ceasefire came into force, with missiles still launched from Iran toward Israel and several Gulf states after the 8 p.m. deadline that was supposed to stop them. The Associated Press reported that the Revolutionary Guard, which has called the shots on all targeting decisions throughout the war, with Iran's political leadership largely sidelined, may not have received or accepted the ceasefire terms in the same way that Iran's foreign minister and Supreme National Security Council announced them. Individual IRGC commanders had made independent targeting decisions throughout the war. Whether they agreed to stop shooting with the declared ceasefire remained in question. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking Wednesday from Budapest where he was attending a conference, warned that there are people within Iran's system who are clearly lying about the nature of the agreement and the nature of the ceasefire. He said if Iranians are willing to work in good faith, they could make an agreement. But if they are going to lie and cheat and try to prevent even the fragile truce from taking place, they are not going to be happy. The word fragile from the Vice President of the United States describing a ceasefire announced 12 hours earlier tells you more about the stability of what was achieved on April 7th than any official celebration from any capital. What Trump claimed he won requires examination against what the documented terms actually show, because the two are not the same, and the gap between them is where the next 40 days of this conflict will be determined. Trump said the United States had met and exceeded all military objectives. The stated objectives of Operation Epic Fury, as described by various administration officials across 40 days of war, included preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, regime change, destruction of Iran's military capability, and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The ceasefire, as announced, does not include Iranian surrender of its enriched uranium stockpile. Iran's Supreme National Security Council explicitly stated in its victory declaration that Iran's right to nuclear enrichment is among the points in the 10-point framework. Netanyahu told Trump in a phone call Sunday, confirmed by 2 sources to ABC News, that Israel believes any ceasefire must require Iran to hand over all enriched uranium and commit to a complete halt of enrichment activities. The ceasefire was announced without those conditions being met. CNN's analysis noted that Trump seemed to imply in his April 1st national address that he would not seek to extract Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, a position that contradicts the stated purpose of the 12-day war in June 2025 and the stated rationale for Operation Epic Fury itself. Iran claimed it won for reasons that are equally documented and equally contested. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said nearly all the objectives of the war have been achieved and published a 10-point 10-point framework that includes lifting all sanctions, releasing frozen assets, U.S. military withdrawal from regional bases, war reparations, and the right to nuclear enrichment. None of these have been agreed to by the United States. Trump called Iran's 10-point proposal a workable basis on which to negotiate, which is not the same as agreeing to it. Trump specifically said the ceasefire was subject to Iran agreeing to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister agreed to safe passage with coordination with Iranian armed forces and due consideration of technical limitations. These are not the same thing. The complete opening that Trump demanded and the coordinated opening with technical limitations that Iran agreed to are two different operating conditions for the world's most important oil shipping lane. So, and the oil market will discover the difference the first time a tanker tests the strait without Iranian coordination. Iran declared victory by claiming the United States had agreed to the general framework of its 10-point proposal. The United States declared victory by claiming it had met all military objectives and extracted Hormuz's reopening. Neither claim is fully supported by the documented terms of the ceasefire as announced. Both claims are designed for domestic political consumption. Both claims cannot simultaneously be accurate. The Islamabad talks scheduled for Friday, April 10th, with VP Vance expected to lead the U.S. delegation, will be the forum where the gap between the two victories is either bridged or exposed. Pakistan's role in this outcome deserves documentation that it has not received proportionate to its importance. Field Marshal Aim Munir, Pakistan's army chief, has been on calls with Vance, Witkoff, and Arachi for 5 consecutive days. Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif led the announcement, invited both delegations to Islamabad on Friday, and expressed deepest gratitude to the leadership of both countries. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ma Ying said Wednesday that China welcomes the ceasefire agreement and noted that Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had held 26 phone calls with counterparts from relevant countries, and that Beijing's special Middle East envoy had shuttled between Gulf nations to build support for a joint Chinese-Pakistani peace proposal. The deal that was announced Tuesday night was a Pakistani achievement in which China played a documented supporting role. The United States did not lead this diplomatic process. The United States accepted an offer that Pakistan constructed and delivered. This is a geopolitical fact that the coming weeks will force every government in the world to incorporate into its assessment of how American leadership operates in the 21st century. The economic consequences of the ceasefire announcement are documented in real-time market data that is unambiguous in its direction, if not in its permanence. Oil fell from $115 down to below $92 in 60 minutes after Trump's announcement. That 13% single-hour decline represents the largest oil price drop in a single trading session since the 2020 pandemic collapse of demand. It represents the return of approximately $300 billion of economic value to global consumers and businesses in the time it takes to watch one episode of a television series. The Strait of Hormuz, carrying 20% of global oil supply, was not actually reopened on Tuesday night. It was promised to be reopened with technical limitations and Iranian coordination. The oil market priced in the promise. What the market will do if the promise is not fully delivered. If Iranian military commanders who have been firing missiles for 40 days decide the ceasefire does not apply to them. If Israel continues operations in Lebanon that Iran's proxies will respond to is the question that every energy analyst is modeling tonight. The human accounting of 40 days of war ended provisionally by a late-night Truth Social post is documented in numbers that no ceasefire announcement erases. More than 2,000 people killed in Iran, including at least 220 children under the age of 18, with the youngest under 12 months old, according to Iran's Ministry of Health. At least 254 women killed. More than 2,400 killed in Lebanon. 19 killed in Israel, 13 Americans killed in combat, 365 Americans wounded, 6 U.S. airmen killed on March 12th in an aircraft crash. One F-15E shot down over Iran on April 3rd, with both crew members recovered after 2 days of rescue operations under fire. 16 MQ-9 Reaper drones lost. One AWACS aircraft destroyed at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. 7,800 targets struck in Iran across 40 days of Operation Epic Fury. The enriched uranium stockpile that justified the war remains in Iran. The nuclear program that cannot be allowed to produce weapons has not been dismantled. The supreme leader who was killed on February 28th has been replaced by his son. The Islamic Republic is still governing. The new Pope Leo IX, the first American pope, had called on all people of goodwill to search for peace and not violence, and to reject war, and had said that attacks on civilian infrastructure, which Trump had threatened in the hours before the ceasefire, are both against international law and a sign of the hatred and destruction the human being is capable of. The UN Secretary General had warned the United States that attacking civilian infrastructure is banned under international law. Legal experts at NPR and Time magazine had documented that Trump's specific threats to destroy power plants, bridges, and water treatment facilities would constitute war crimes under the Geneva Conventions and their protocols. Trump, when asked Monday if he was concerned about committing war crimes, had said no. The ceasefire was announced before those threats were executed. The legal question of whether 40 days of documented strikes on civilian infrastructure, universities, hospitals, and residential areas constitute violations of international humanitarian law will not disappear because a ceasefire was announced. The Islamabad talks begin Friday. VP Vance is expected to lead the American delegation. Iran's delegation will be led by officials who have already been told by their Supreme National Security Council that this does not signify the termination of the war. Israel, which launched the war jointly with the United States, has told the world that the ceasefire does not include Lebanon and continued airstrikes on Lebanese territory after it was announced. The IRGC, which operates independently of Iran's political leadership, continued to fire missiles after the ceasefire's stated effective time. The gap between Trump's victory and Iran's victory is the territory inside which the next 14 days will determine whether 40 days of the most destructive conflict in the Middle East since the 2003 Iraq War ends in a permanent agreement or a resumed escalation. Both sides said they won. Both sides are still armed. Both sides said the other one is misrepresenting the terms. The guns fell mostly silent. The strait is partially open on Iranian terms. The enriched uranium is still in Iran. The Islamic Republic is still standing. The Islamabad talks begin Friday, and the golden age of the Middle East that Trump promised is either 2 weeks away or a phrase that will be quoted for the next decade as the moment when American diplomacy described a situation that the facts did not support. Subscribe, enable notifications, enable one. Share this before Friday when the Islamabad talks begin, and both delegations arrive with completely different understandings of what was agreed on Tuesday night. We will be here to document every verified fact of what is negotiated, what is conceded, and what the war that paused on April 7th actually achieved. Drop your answers below. Every comment is read. The most analytical responses are featured. Question A, Trump declared victory. Iran declared victory. Netanyahu said the ceasefire does not include Lebanon. Missiles were still fired after the ceasefire's stated effective time. And so, VP Vance called the truce fragile within 12 hours of the announcement. If both sides claiming victory means neither side conceded what the other side says they conceded. What happens in Islamabad on Friday when the two delegations sit across from each other and compare their victory statements against the actual terms? Question B. Iran's Supreme National Security Council published a 10-point framework claiming it represents what the United States agreed to, including sanctions relief, asset release, U.S. military withdrawal from regional bases, reparations, and the right to nuclear enrichment. Trump said Iran's 10 points are a workable basis to negotiate, not an agreement. Which of Iran's 10 points will the United States agree to in Islamabad? And which one will cause the ceasefire to collapse if the United States refuses? Question C. Pakistan brokered this deal. China made 26 diplomatic phone calls to support it. The United States accepted a Pakistani proposal for a ceasefire in a war the United States started. The Strait of Hormuz will reopen with Iranian coordination and technical limitations, not the complete, immediate, and safe opening Trump demanded. The enriched uranium stays in Iran. The Islamic Republic still governs. What did 40 days of Operation Epic Fury, 13 American deaths, 365 American wounded, and $19 oil actually achieve that could not have been achieved through the diplomacy that was available on February 27th? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for next Global News Desk, so please subscribe this channel for next update.